Good morning and welcome to MACMH's Community Podcast Series. We're here to inform, inspire, and support. I'm the host, Twana Anderson, the Community Engagement Director, and I want to thank you for taking the time out today to tune in. Here, we invite our partners to join us for a conversation about their organization's service to the community, challenges they may be facing, and what their future plans are. All the while weaving throughout ideas to help you have an impact on a child's mental health journey. As usual, we are streaming this episode live, but it will be available anytime you feel like learning something about children's mental health and the community that serves them. If you enjoy this video, please help spread the word. This is our second podcast series, and we're very, very excited for today. Also, during the episode, we'll make references to books, articles, videos, other information that will support the knowledge you'll gain during our time together today. You'll find those links in the description along with contact information for our guests so that you can stay connected. I also want to encourage the audience to respectfully ask questions of our guests in our YouTube chat. We'll keep an eye on things and see if our guest panelists will be willing to answer any and if there is time. The Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health has a mission to promote and pursue optimal mental health from infancy to young adulthood. Every topic of this podcast is approached with an open and critical mind, exploring opportunities to view circumstances through a different lens. Being in this space means we advocate for all children to have equal access and opportunities to develop the skills to nourish their lives. We begin to help others remove their blinders while also being challenged to remove our own. We need to see other people, appreciate their perspectives, and perhaps even learn from their journeys. Engaging with MACMH, with the community, is what I do for MACMH. And this podcast is something new that we're doing to share our partners with you. We are a professional development organization. That is our jam. We provide excellent educational opportunities, providers and educators, offering continuing education online in our training series or through one of our 2 leading annual children's mental health conferences. We also recognize the need to provide our resources in a different and unique way that reaches everyone. You may have thought to yourselves, podcast isn't very unique, and you are correct. But whether you're a parent or a caregiver, a relative, or friend of a child or young person who may struggle with their emotional awareness, we hope that sharing our resources with you in this way will become a valuable tool for you. There are mental health issues that are specific to young Black boys that are not being addressed, and we must offer encouragement, give them permission, and provide safe spaces where they can be vulnerable. Throughout this podcast series, we'll discuss and provide tangible instruction on how you can work together, how we can all work together to heal our communities. Today, in this second episode of the series, we will define trauma and how it shows up, racial trauma, individual, family, community, and historical trauma. We'll do a deep dive into historical trauma specifically, our lived experiences, and how the effects show up in our children, Black boys specifically. The goal is to provide information that helps explain what this means so that our audience clearly understands the external factors that affect our mental health. I also want to just take this moment to state that this podcast conversation is not an endorsement of our special guest in particular. We are simply sharing with the audience options and opportunities that exist in our communities throughout the Twin Cities that are here to help the audience gain knowledge and learn about the resources available to support the children and young people in your lives. All right, now we are going to introduce our special guests, Sam Simmons, Leo Howard, and Bobby Arnold. Let me bring these wonderful gentlemen onto the screen and then make sure that I get everything set up the way it should be. Hello, hello, hello. How are y'all doing today?
Pretty good.
Doing well.
Can't complain.
Doing well.
Awesome. Listen, let me do just a really quick introduction for you all. Very short this time. Bobby Arnold is from St. Paul, Minnesota, and a recent St. Paul Johnson High School graduate. Was also a standout athlete on their football team. Bobby is also an author of a book of poetry he created for his peers and is on his way to Augsburg College this year. Leo Howard is a program manager at the Greater Twin Cities United Way. Their program called 80 by 3 Resilient from the Start, which is a trauma informed care for Minnesota's littlest learners. And Mr. Samuel Simmons is the owner of Samuel Simmons Consulting, whose work involves practical and culturally sensitive trauma informed approaches that focus on ways to support individuals and organizations working in the African American community. Mr. Simmons, you are also a co host on the Voices radio show on KMOJ. Can you let the audience know, like, the day and the time that you're on KMOJ and how we can tune in to support you?
We're on Fridays at 6 o'clock on KMOJ, which is 89.9 on the radio dial FM, talking about topics that are of interest to the urban community.
I love it. So, did you know that I used to be a DJ on KMOJ?
No, I didn't.
Yes. So, Q Bear is my cousin through marriage. And when I first moved here in 1995, showed interest. I wanted to be a volunteer DJ. I want to be a volunteer DJ. And I finally got the opportunity to do it. And was on the radio Sunday, like late Sundays, and then on Wednesdays, midday, during the employers roundtable. Do they still do that?
No.
Oh, that was a really excellent program. And at the time, I had no, interest in being on the fire department, but that's where I got my introduction to the fire department. They were coming in like 3 weeks in a row, and they did this, presented the opportunity for folks to join the fire department. They had just gotten over a lawsuit that claimed that they had unfair hiring practices for Black people. And so there was a lawsuit that we won. They had to reach out to Black communities to recruit. And that's how I learned about the fire department. I ended up taking the test, doing the physical, doing all that stuff. And I'm a retired Minneapolis firefighter. I don't know if y'all know that. But I wanted to point that out because that just happened in 2001. Like in 2000, we were still suing to make sure that we had equal access to things. And I don't know that people understand and recognize how historical trauma contributes to all kinds of things with our community. So I'm really, really excited about having this conversation.
Okay.
All right. Let's define trauma. All right. Although trauma is talked about a lot more, I think, today than it has been in the past, we still want to take a little time to define what historical trauma is, Mr. Simmons. Would you mind starting us off and giving us a general idea of what historical trauma is?
So, do you want to start with trauma or historical trauma?
How about we start with trauma and then move to historical trauma, just so that we can get a clear understanding?
Okay. Well, when we think about trauma, the typical definition that you might find in a dictionary might be physical, emotional harm or threatening events or injury that have a lasting effect, adverse effect on the individual's functioning physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. That would be the dictionary version. But the version I usually refer to is anything that happens too much, too fast, or too soon for you to metabolize and move through it. And when it happens, you get stuck. So, and the reason I prefer that definition is that to let folks know not everybody's affected by events the same way. And so, again, if you think about too much, that would include the kind of the historical stuff. Too fast, that would include things like childhood trauma, having adult experiences as a child, or and the same thing about too soon. Too soon might be before you're ready or mature enough to handle. But the big piece is getting stuck. emotionally and not being able to work through it for various reasons. One is might be because we don't have the support we need. Two, we might not understand what we might be going through. And the other thing about trauma, it is not a personal failure or defect. And I think you mentioned that there's more talk about trauma now, but that's really, I think I would say more talk about trauma in our community. Our communities have had a lot of difficulty having a conversation about trauma, and and I understand to some degree why. When you've been exposed to the amount of trauma we have been,
Yeah.
since coming to this country, especially us who have uh, American slavery in our background. And the other thing about trauma, it is something that happens to anybody, right? You know, good, bad, or indifferent. But how do we sort through those events? Really depends on a lot of environmental things, family things, and community things. And so, but historical trauma basically is trauma that happens to one generation, and the results of it being passed down, the collective results are passed down to the next generation, and shows up in future generations, even though they haven't experienced the original trauma in many cases. But and that's probably an overview of that. But the one that I usually try to take a look at is what we call post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is talked about by Joy DeGruy, who really looks at specifically the effects of chattel slavery and not really working through some of that. And chattel slavery followed by institutional racism and oppression. So think about that. You were in slavery for 246, over 240 years. They tell you you're free, and they treat you anything but free. Think about what kind of psychological effect that could have on the people when you say I'm free, and then every time I turn around, I'm getting these roadblocks, right? It would be like having a foster child where the child family is having some real major issues. You go in, you take the child out the home, and you put them in a foster care home, and they get treated either just as bad or worse, and you told them it was going to be better, right?
Yeah.
And you're doing as a kid, you're doing all the things you think people want you to do. But like I said, every time you turn around, it's like, a good example of that would be Tulsa and many other cities, where we're paying our bills, we're taking care of our children, we're getting good education, and and you know, and then you still have an issue with us, and I call that the curse of black excellence, which is another conversation probably for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I did today, a little bit different from our first time together, is I found some video clips to just kind of support what our conversation is today. One of the terms that I've learned through my research is epigenetics, right? Which is kind of the word that we use to describe what all of this historical trauma even means. So if you don't mind, I just want to share a little bit of this video so that we can get a little bit better idea of what we're talking about. So let's listen for a moment. This is about a minute long. It's not very long, and it's just part of a broader conversation that was being had on PBS. This will be available in the link will be available in the description. So let's listen to this for a moment.
I'm going to start with you. When you hear racial generational trauma, you're trying to get your head around it. But what I've come to learn from preparing for this show is that it's not psychological only, it's also physiological. and something called epigenetics has a part to play. Would you please describe what that is?
Sure. Epigenetics really comes out of the work of Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who was at the Cleveland Clinic and at Mount Sinai Hospital. And she's one of the leading experts in post-traumatic stress disorder. And what she began to investigate and interrogate was looking at the impact of trauma on genetics and really beginning to think about trauma as a genetic marker. And her entree into looking at this work was through survivors, she's Jewish, and looking at survivors of the Holocaust and really seeing correlations between survivors and then intergenerational trauma and impact on genetic markers across the survivors. I remember listening to her work once with Krista Tippett and a discussion on her show On Being, driving to the Cape and literally pulling my car over because I thought, this is, if we're talking about the impact of trauma as it relates to the Holocaust, what then does this look like in terms of thinking about 400 years of trauma on genetic markers and what has been passed down across generations? And the piece that we don't talk about is what happened with people who were being mated, if you will, to create new supplies of bodies. So trauma, being mated with trauma, being passed across generations explains a lot about what has happened 18, 19 generations later in terms of the numbing, depression, the challenges around building intimate relationships. What I talk about is the flattened affect as a presentation of trauma. And the work of Resmaa Menakem, who takes Dr. Yehuda's work even further, talks about what happens when trauma becomes culture. So
okay.
that.
All right, that's the part that I wanted to get to, is what happens when trauma becomes culture. Now, Leo, I want to bring you in at this point because I want to also take a look at, because you are coming with the voice for our younger children, the early infant and childhood age children. And one of the ways that trauma shows up in their lives, they've just defined it as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, potentially traumatic events that occur in their childhood. Can you expand on what those ACEs are and how the trauma shows up in our children in so many different ways?
Definitely. So some of the adverse childhood experiences are things that are really common to a lot of us. And I'll start with talking about, what they could look like, and then kind of pivot into what I've seen show up in our older kids, because I come to this work, I'm in the early childhood work now, but I come to this work from the juvenile justice side of things. Yes. And a lot of my experience with that work, I would find myself asking the question, what if this young person had this support from birth? What if they had these, we have like Mary T. Welcome or Phyllis Wheatley or a Baby Space or Centro, these organizations that are providing this social emotional learning? What if and that was my question that I would ask myself, who is doing that work? So I'll take a step back, and ACEs, and I'll kind of point to what Mr. Simmons said earlier. I want to make sure that I put the caveat out there that everything impacts everyone differently. But I will say, with some of these adverse childhood experiences, it can be something as simple as your parents splitting up. It can be fights, arguments in the household. It could be a lack of resources. It can be abuse. It can be, and I think one of the biggest things is that people look at some of these adverse childhood experiences and think that they have to be the worst of the worst. Like, you got to see somebody get shot, or you got to see someone die. And it doesn't have to be that serious. It doesn't have to be that great. It can be not having a supportive person other than your parent in your life. Like, we need supportive people. We need community outside of our parents, outside of our household. So if you don't have that, that can be an ACE. And for me, what I've seen throughout the duration of my professional and my lived experience is that you get to a point where these young people get to be 16, 17, 18, and they are so just opposed to and just really against any form of traditional therapy, anything of talking about trauma, like even getting into the topic, because what they've learned is talking about those things, speaking about it, even thinking about it can make me vulnerable, can put me in a position where I can be taken advantage of. And so what
Yes.
happens is behaviors are learned. You get to a space where young people have for so long been taught and learned that I got to figure this out by myself. Even if you're not consciously sitting with that, even if you're not thinking about it, you have enough experiences where you cry and you cry and you cry, and no one ever responds to that cry. You develop this space. You get to this point where it's hard to actually develop relationships. You mentioned it before, Tawana, like in the video that we watched, you get to a space where you can't develop those healthy relationships because you haven't had experience doing it. And so what happens is our young people get in this space where they're 16, 17, 18. Society tells them, you should know how to do this. You should know how to develop these relationships. You should know how to cope. You should have these, you know, strategies to decompress, to regulate yourself. But the thing is, they've never had it. They've never had someone actually show them. And if they have, it hasn't been consistent enough they haven't had enough benevolent childhood experiences. And so those benevolent childhood experiences are sort of the flip side to the ACEs. They are the things that combat it. So I talked about the relationship aspect before. So having a caregiver outside of home, in a school, in an institution, organization that's outside of your family, that's a benevolent childhood experience. Having just the ability to have someone to come and pick you up when you're crying or give you that attention, take you through the steps to learn and experience the social emotional learning that you need. Those are also benevolent childhood experiences. And a lot of people look at those and say, aren't these things that everyone has? Doesn't everyone have someone who will just pick them up, just talk to them, just reading to them? And the answer is no, absolutely not. And I think coupling that with the fact that they don't have it, often our parents are demonized. The caregivers, the parents, they're demonized and put in a space where people are asking the questions, well, why aren't you doing this? Why can't you do this to help? And there definitely is some personal responsibility. But I think that it gets to a space where people are asking the question of what's wrong with you instead of what happened to you.
Right.
And a lot of the ACEs, I think, a lot of the things when we talk about this comes down to that. Did I answer the question that you're getting at?
Absolutely. I think you covered it all, because that's one of the things that I've been learning. As I've mentioned before, I don't have the clinical background, or the education about children's mental health, how our children develop. I didn't know any of those things until I started this job. So yes, that definitely helps. And again, the whole point for us having this conversation is for people to recognize that there is more to our mental health journey as a community that affects even how we raise our children. So,
Can I say one more thing about that, Tawana? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, Leo. Go ahead.
The last thing I was gonna say is that it creates a cycle. You get to a space where that becomes normalized. The ACEs, the trauma, like we said, what happens when that becomes culture? What happens when trauma becomes culture? And what happens is you have this whole community of people that have survived instead of thrived. And so the outlook on living is different when you get to a space. And that's one of the biggest things I saw being in the juvenile justice side of things, is that people really got to a space where it was like, well, I didn't have all this support. I didn't have this. And look how I turned out. I turned out just fine. I didn't have someone who listened, who did this and who did that. When I got in trouble, I got beat and this, that, and the third happened, and it saved me. And my response to that has always been, just because you didn't have those things doesn't mean you didn't deserve them. And just because you're, out here and you're living and you're productive and you're doing things in life, that doesn't mean that you didn't deserve that support. That doesn't mean that you didn't deserve those benevolent childhood experiences. And a lot of times what I saw is that people personalize it. They take it in and they personalize the behaviors of the young people and get to a space where it's like, they're doing this to me. And it really gets to a space where it's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle where the people who are supposed to be helping our young people end up blaming them, and putting it all on them. That's the last thing I'm gonna say.
No, but that's a good point. And that's again, one of the things that we want to do here on this podcast is really talk about the effects of historical trauma and familiar trauma and how we as individuals internalize that and pass it on generation to generation. That's where that cycle comes through, right? And Bobby, you're getting ready to start college. I don't know if you've already been educated about cycles. But in sociology, in psychology, in all of those ologies, there are cycles, whether it's a cycle of deviance or cycle of poverty, or there's a cycle for everything. And what I want to ask you, Bobby, as our young person expert on this is how do you feel trauma and historical trauma in Black communities have even affected your family? And do you have these conversations with your peer group, with friends, with people that you're going to school with? Is this even a topic of conversation for you?
Is this a topic? I feel like with peers, we definitely do touch on it. Like, it's definitely do touched on. We definitely talk about it with like more so friends. I feel like for my age, for the age range that I am, it's kind of harder for my friends to be able to understand the emotional side and evaluation of like how they feel and the trauma that they go through. It's kind of like, I feel like we're trauma affected. Well, what I am as being a young Black man the most is like, as they said, feel like if I don't have that figure, like that positive male figure, either my father or a mentor, I have to figure out like I have to do it on my own, And I feel like that's kind of what it goes for a lot of young Black men, that if they don't have this, they have to figure it out on their own. They have to kind of go out there and realize that either they have to find money, they have to find emotional help, they have to find some way to get out of anger. You feel me? If you don't have that positive role model, for me, I had my mother. Hope like that was my positive role model growing up. But I feel like if you don't have that, you kind of go into a desperate need to find it. If you don't have money, people you sell drugs, people scam, people rob, shoot, like they do all these things, and it's kind of hard to think on, like trying to understand that emotional side to trauma. But you definitely do see it in a lot of like people's mannerisms, how people talk, how people act in certain situations, how people body tense up when they're faced with hard conversations, or how they get, sometimes for a lot of people my age, we tend to get passive aggressive when trauma is like talked about. When that situation, when they bring it up, people tend to get passive aggressive, be like, act like they don't care about it, or they don't want to hear about it, because I feel like it's because that they don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how, like they said, don't know how to be vulnerable in certain situations, don't know how to speak up for their mental health, for the emotional side, for who they are as a person. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers it.
It did. Do I really love and respect your mother. We've only met in person once, have had a couple of conversations, but how do conversations about mental health happen in your household?
In my household,
Yeah.
It's kind of, sometimes it's two different ways. Either it's my mom coming to me and like, talking to me like, hey, like certain things you have to fix up your act, or like if something's going on and she asks me about it, I have to tell her. Or sometimes it's honestly just random conversations. Me and my mom's kind of like the same person, like intellectually, like how we think. So sometimes it's just a random conversation of asking, like, because like she's my first teacher. Before school, she's my first teacher. So if I need something, or if I need to learn something, or if I like want to get an opinion on something, I go to her like, hey, like, just ask her, how do you feel like about trauma for Black men throughout history? And she's a very insightful person. So she tells me a lot of historical history, a lot of like things, just for me to be able to understand certain different like emotional evaluations. So yeah, I'll say that's the way.
Yeah, that's awesome that you have that support at home. Do you feel like, and I'm just talking about your friends, your peer group, do you think that most of your friends have that same support at home, or are they struggling to find that support outside of, immediate caregivers or adults that are in their lives?
I feel like for my peers who go to the same school as me, the school that I went to, Johnson, they had a really good like foundation of staff, teachers, and just coaches who you can go to be able to talk to. We ran groups to like even have these conversations, to have these emotional, intellectual conversations about trauma, being a young black man and stuff. So I feel like outside of school, they like it's pretty good. Like it'll be pretty good, but I don't know per se like in the household, but I know for some of my friends it's hard having that emotional maturity, especially at such a young age, especially when you go through situations where you have to grow up faster. You feel me?
Yeah.
You didn't have that much time to be a kid through either like, being homeless, being working since like the age of 12. Like these are all things that like people think is normal, think is okay, think is like, oh, you've been working since, oh yeah, that's cool. Like, no, it's not a normal thing. People don't understand that. Like, some of the things that we went through as children, we shouldn't have been going through. And that's not because our parents are bad people, with that just because that's the situation we have been dealt with.
Right.
And you got to find a way to be able to talk about that, to be able to understand, I went through this as a kid and it kind of affected me to this day now, to how I move, to how I stress about when I need a job. Like you'll see kids, like especially me, like you'll see kids that at my age that if they don't have a job, they shut down. You feel me? If they don't have that source
Sure.
of money, no income, you feel me? They shut down. That's because that's what they seen through childhood. That's what they've been dealt with. That's what, you feel me? So I just feel like things like that, things of that nature.
That's so interesting, Mr. Simmons. One of the things I want to just jump back a little bit to talk about how historical trauma affects Black folks specifically, Black men specifically, because I feel like that's going to be the bridge between embracing our young Black boys and really encouraging them to be vulnerable, talk about their mental health, learn how they cope and grow their emotional awareness. But let's talk a little bit more about how trauma shows up in our communities, because I don't know that most people think about it, Mr. Simmons, in that way. And just coming off the heels of your Black Men Healing Conference, that specifically talks about these things, that has amazing Black men attending and talking about their feelings and sharing their journeys to optimal mental health. So tell us a little bit more about how that shows up in our communities.
Oh my goodness. Well,
You don't have it on.
there's well, the thing is how it shows up is in many different ways. So one of the things about us in trauma, we have spent more time trying to self-medicate our trauma without understanding that we're dealing with trauma. Trauma has become, for a long time, part of our community existence. A lot of stuff that we call culture are trauma responses, right? So if you don't understand, if you're living it, you're not calling it trauma. You're calling it, keeping it real, right? And then if you call it culture, and then you get somebody outside of the culture, or somebody in the culture even, that says you need to either adjust that or change that, I will fight you over that, right? I remember
Yeah.
when we first started having real conversations about corporal punishment of children, you know, uh, especially in the efforts when we start talking about child protection and those kind of things, and having the system tell you, the system gonna tell me how I got to deal with my kids, and we have found, a lot of times we was thinking about corporal punishment as that's just the way we do it in the culture. That whole idea is, sparing the rod and all these other kind of pieces, right? If we look back, especially when it comes to boys,
Yeah.
we spent a lot of time being hard on boys trying to save them. Think about that.
Yep.
That's the response to trauma, right? Think about being in the 1950s, right? and down south, and your child, or Emmett Till's a prime example. You got
Yes.
little kid who's raised in Chicago, go down south, say something, and we don't know exactly what he said. All we can go by what people say to this woman in this store, and he ends up killed. The traumatic effect
Yes.
on black people. I'm from down south. I could have been Emmett Till. Emmett Till was killed a year after I was born. Do you understand? I never seen downtown Charleston until I was 30 years old, because our family was scared of these little smart mouth little children from up north getting
Yeah.
hurt. Okay, so when we talk about a trauma, or then if we talk about again about boys and this whole adage, because you used to hear it all the time. You can't be soft on these boys because the world ain't gonna be soft on them, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you're hard on me, the world is hard on me. Where do I feel safety?
Say
Okay,
that one more
so
time. My
now
goodness, right there.
where do I feel safety? Right?
Yeah.
And then we did that out of our care, but we did it out of fear. We had done a lot of parenting out of fear. Okay? So if I'm 14, full of myself, and I'm down south, and I tell you I'm not scared of the white man, well, I'm your parent. I am. And
Yes.
now, and if I'm not scared of white people, I'm scared for you. So I'd rather beat you down to get your attention than to let you go out there. Because I don't know how to do much more than that. Okay? And then you
Yeah.
pass that down, and then again, if you call it culture, how do I let it go and still keep my black card? See, I don't have a lot of time to have a conversation about white folks and trauma.
Right.
Okay? Because we can talk about that all day. That's easy. That's right there in our face. I want to talk about how that trauma affects how we have these relationships with each other. I know, like Leo was talking about the young people he was dealing with, and talking about, who got blamed, what, or whatever. I don't even have time for the blaming. We've got to do the understanding, right? We have come up short a lot of times in our parenting because the folks before us came up short because of their fear and their lack of understanding around this thing of ACEs. I'm a state trainer. Early I was trained by the folks who wrote some of the books, right? And they didn't want us to talk to them. They said, I don't know if you want to talk to your parents about that because it might make them feel bad. Man, I
Right.
go and talk to the parents, and they say, Mr. Sims, why ain't nobody telling us this? Now I know why I do some of the crazy stuff I've done. I'm doing it because I didn't know no better.
Right.
Okay? And so our fear of talking about trauma is because we've been so conditioned to be embarrassed of our own condition that wasn't done to us. So we think if we admit to the trauma, that proves like what we believe folks think there's something wrong with us. No,
Yeah.
something happened to us. The problem is we got to recognize something happened to us and recognize it has an effect on how we relate to each other. And every generation we don't get an understanding of that, the worse it gets. Okay? And so when we talk about the trauma, we could talk about the trauma on men, but we could talk about the community trauma. And when I do my lecture on historical trauma, I break it down into segments. What blow did the community take? Right? And then
Yes.
and how do we recover? But the last blow, the first blow is slavery. The last blow has been the last 40 years that came about with crack. We haven't recovered from that. We'll tell you why we haven't recovered from that. It's because that was the era when babies truly couldn't trust adults. Think about that.
Wow.
Not only could you not trust adults, you couldn't even, in some cases, trust your mama. In the black community, if nobody else you could trust, you could at least trust your mama.
Yeah.
Okay? And
Absolutely.
crack has such a devastating effect on black women, the keepers of the community. I don't care, some folks might not like that. They have historically been the keepers of the community, no matter what the struggles of black men were. When that got affected, that had a major effect on the community, major effect on children. See, we argue a lot about male female relationships and all that, but we don't focus enough on the children. If me and the other person having the children can't get along, then you wonder, and how we going, if we can't get along, how am I going to stay in the child's life,
Yeah.
right? And we haven't even learned that piece. So so the issue comes down to the last 4 years. So grandparents that we're dealing with right now would have been 12, 13 years old during the cracker. So them babies practically had to raise themselves. And even if they weren't directly affected, they had cousins that were affected. And if you was in any major city, young people were running the city because they had locked up all the OGs.
Right.
And you, even though you got a gun in your hand, you're still a baby, and you got a baby mind. And a baby mind, a scared baby mind, is a dangerous mind,
Woo.
and it's based on the moment. I'm not thinking no deeper than that.
Yeah.
Like the young man was talking about, I'm thinking about getting paid and being safe and having some place to live in that night. I'm not having these deep conversations, right? And then when I take somebody's life, I go get high, get drunk, and that would then when you're talking about chemical dependency, we even have to look at that differently in the community around our trauma, right? And so right now we're the third, fourth generation of young people who almost don't care, and some of them are not scared of dying. They're
Yeah.
less scared of dying, and the more afraid of living than dying. But no, our response as adults, and then we want to talk about white folks. Black folks' response ain't no better. We're sometimes we're more judgmental of our babies than anybody else.
Yes.
That's why I don't have a time for that other conversation right now, because there's a whole bunch of folks who want to have that conversation. If we don't have a real conversation internally about this stuff, the world passes by and has been trying to pass us by anyway. But the thing is that trauma, I'm glad we're having this conversation. This was the first year at the conference. I believe folks got it. All my
Yeah.
presenters got it. I was quite pleased. Think about it, I've been doing this for 16 years, and I think I've been fully pleased only twice. The first one and this one. Okay? Even
Yeah.
though everybody thinks they're the greatest things in toast and all, that's fine and all like that. And you want to talk about, oh, Mr. Simmons, I don't care nothing about that. I'm worried about our babies, these young folks like Bobby and them, who are that we're talking to them about having conversations that are so deep they shouldn't even they shouldn't have to have them. They should be able to be young people and feel safe
Yeah.
and feel comfortable. And we're asking them about having these deep conversations that their mamas and daddies don't even have.
Woo.
So
Mr.
I
Simmons.
so yeah, I'm tired. I,
And I feel it. I feel it from you. I'm full of goosebumps right now, because we should be tired of having this conversation. But as you just pointed out, we're not really having the conversation. It's not what we have been doing. We have not. We haven't been vulnerable as adults to even sit down in a room full of other adults to even talk about it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because when you say anything about slavery or mention the past, one of the first responses are, "Oh, that was so long ago. I didn't have anything to do with any of that. Why should I care?" And so I think it's really important today that we establish why people should care. I have another video that I want to share real quick before I
Hold
get
on.
back to the video. Go ahead,
Can I
Bobby.
address something? So
Absolutely.
something that I feel like what Mr. Simmons was said. I feel like a lot what people don't see in this generation, that a lot of our young black men don't know how to build relationships with older black men that's 30, black men that's older, not because that we don't want to, but because we was never faced with that at a young age. And when you're not faced with the skills of, like how Mr. Leo said, of building relationships at a young age, when you get older, you kind of reject it, you kind of neglect it. When somebody that genuinely cares for you, that can genuinely wants to see you do better and help push you forward, wants to come into your life, we tend to reject that, especially people around my age. We tend to be like, nah, bro, you're lame, you're this, that. We cuss them out, we get mad and angry. And not because that we don't want that. Nah, deeply we want that. But that side is ourselves that we want it. we buried that so far deep within trauma, within, okay, nah, I have to do this on my own. When you're faced with that reality that I have to do this on my own because nobody can do it for me, it's hard to get out of. You feel me? Like, especially for me, that's one thing I'll probably say I'll struggle with is I have to learn how to go out there, ask for help. Like, hey, can you help me? Hey, can you help me do this? It's a very hard thing to overcome, and it's a very weird thing. Like, I didn't realize, I only started realizing now. For me, it's hard to build a relationship with a older black dude. You feel me? Just because I didn't have that necessarily in the household growing up. For me, you feel me, only had my mom as my biggest figure, but I had to always go outside the household. I had to go find a mentor. I had to go talk to a coach. And not all those people that I had to talk to are still in my life to this day. You feel me? They came in for a season and they left because their season was over with. You feel me? And
Yeah.
just that, you don't know how to build a relationship properly. You don't know how to sustain somebody in your life. You don't know how to, hey, pick up the phone. Hey, I've been having, you feel me, anxiety, depression, all those things. It's because we wasn't faced with it as a child. So now understanding that on an emotional level is a hard thing to overcome.
That's great insight, Bobby. Go ahead, Sam. And Leo, I think you wanted to respond as well. So go ahead.
Leo,
Yeah.
we'll let Leo go.
I was gonna say honestly, thank you, Bobby, for saying that, because I think me myself as a 30-year-old man, professionally, and I'm not even talking about personally, professionally, you're expected to network, you're expected to meet people, you're expected to go out and build these connections. And I remember I asked this question at this a few years ago. Kente Circle had a big presentation that they were putting on, and I asked the question in front of everybody, like, how do you as black men, specifically black men, network when growing up? There's honestly parts of my life where I've had to put this facade up. I could be happy, but I got to walk down the street with a mug on my face because I can't be taken advantage of. You can't just walk willy-nilly down the street sometimes smiling, waving at people, because then you can be looked at as a victim. And so for me, my thank you for Bobby is for lifting that up. And honestly, like, kind of bringing that to the forefront, because that's something that I struggled with for a long time and currently working through that. And Bobby said this last week, Mr. Bobby said this last week, that it's important that when we experience these things and then we get to the other side, or we're actually working through it, to double back and talk to the people who are doing it and who are trying to get that going as well. Because it's so hard, like you said, Mr. Arnold, to be in a space where you just call somebody up, or you're just like, hey, like, I want to do that. And a lot of times it gets passed off as, oh, they hate, oh, they don't want to learn, they don't want to do this, they don't want to do that. But it's like, I don't know how. I don't feel comfortable doing that, because I've had people telling me, keep to yourself. Don't just go talking to people with all these things that you grow up in. What happens in this house stays in this house. You can't just be walking around smiling at people. My dad told me the story when he was growing up in Chicago, walking around when he first moved to Minnesota. He said people were saying hi to him on the street and he couldn't understand why. He was like, why the hell are they talking to me? Why are you saying hi to me? Like, I don't do that. And and we're talking about genetics and things being passed down. I didn't grow up in Chicago, but growing up in South Minneapolis, there was definitely times where it was like, I just need to get from point A to point B. I need to get from over here to over there. I'm not going to talk to nobody. I'm not going to say nothing. And I'm going to just be about my way. So if you grow up experiencing that time and time again, and then you have little glimmers here and there, you have people like a Bobby Lay from Sabathany with Horizons Youth Program, and a Marvin and people like that, you start to, like, there's like little cracks in that armor that you got on, that facade that you put on. People can start to be, we call them protective factors. And what Mr. Arnold was talking about before is us becoming those protective factors for our young black men, seeing that, okay, this is something that I struggled with. Let me double back and make sure that I can be that light for somebody else. And I think one of the most important things he said was that, it's not always for years and years. Like, those impact can be a few weeks, a few months, but they can have a long lasting impact. So I just want to say thank you for that. And, like, also bring it to the fact that this impacts us in our professional lives as well. Being able to network, being able to build that, which in turn can prevent us from leveling up, which can stop us from moving up to the next level. And again, contributes to that cycle that we're in.
Absolutely.
Well,
Mr. Simmons, your turn.
isn't isn't this special? Um, See, and I love this. I love that Bobby brought this up, and that's why I let Leo go after me because I'm old as dirt, and and I don't claim to be no mentor because I'm not into mentorship, believe it or not. See, I think we have put so much pressure on men who are doing well that's overwhelming too.
Mm,
I ain't having it.
mm,
Okay. I'm not trying to save everybody.
mm,
See, we put so much pressure on ourselves as black people trying to live up to some standard that I don't think any man can live up to. Especially when we start doing right. Think about it. When you start doing right, the pressure that's put on you when you start doing right is so overwhelming sometimes you just want to go hide somewhere.
mm.
Okay? Because it's much easier doing this silly
Yeah.
crap out here, right?
Right.
You can get up and do some silly crap, but I'm willing to believe that right now, when Bobby's thinking about, he is right. Because it's like it takes a lot of work to do the right thing, and it shouldn't be that way, right?
True. Yeah.
That's why I ain't got time to have no deep conversation. I will have a conversation about how systems and white systems and white supremacy have had effect on us in very negative ways. We can't ignore that. But we really have to have this honest conversation about we haven't been that nice to our children because of that trauma, especially as men, right? We have to be. There's a clip from Fences I use a lot in the backyard when Denzel that because there's many different clips of Fences because you got the old ones and that kind of stuff, but all the same in the backyard telling them I don't have to like you.
Mm.
I was raised with that idea. I just got if I am think about how much credit old black men got for just being in the house, not having no emotional connection with their children.
Right.
They weren't being considered a good man,
Yeah.
right? I do groups with young men from the ages of 18 to what 45, 50. Sometimes they put them old dudes in my group, which get on my last nerves because them old dudes they automatically think young cats are supposed to automatically respect them. And now think about it. You in my group for the same thing the young dude doing, and you're gonna tell the young dude, y'all don't listen and see, and then when the young dude tell you, why am I supposed to listen to you? You in the same group I'm in, and then you want to fight. And so I get guys when I tell them, because I always talk about being old. See, I enjoy being old. Do you
Yes.
understand how many of my peers have not been lived long enough to be old, at least my age, and look as good as I do? Huh?
That's
So
real.
Yes.
when I tell them how old I am, I had one young man break down in tears. He
Wow.
says, Mr. Simmons, I have never talked to a black man your age.
Wow.
Okay?
Wow.
And there's the quote I have, what I call my Uncle Big quote. A role model, somebody who knows the babies are watching and acts accordingly. And what I mean by that, you have the responsibility as a black man. You got to understand that babies are watching you all the time. You can't just be a role model when it's time to be on TV. We got a bunch of them, and people look up to them folks. But you catch them cats behind closed doors, they're some of the most raggedy, ruthless people under the sun. And some of these young people know that.
Yeah.
And we can't elevating them folks. Okay? I
Yeah.
am not trying to be, but maybe behind the scenes people might think I'm reckless, but I don't care, and I ain't trying to hide. Okay. Again, I'm not. I don't have a lot of time. But the thing is what's weird to me is ornery as I am, young people like me for some reason. Maybe they just don't know no better. Because I talk smack to them just as much as they talk back to me. One of my clients last week, what Bobby made me think about. I had a client I was interviewing to be in my group, cutting me out. Talking about Why you want to send me to jail and all that? Like, Negro, I don't care nothing about you. It's not my job.
Oh
So
my
so
goodness.
now you want to have a conversation with me? I said I'm not like them other people. I said I'm trying to get you in my group, and you sitting here accusing me of trying to send you to jail because I told your PO you wasn't here.
Oh my goodness.
I'm accountable to me. And if you don't know how, are you a man? Yeah, I'm a man. Well, I'm treating you like a man. Be responsible for yourself. Now, you want to have a conversation? Do you want to be in the group? All
Yeah.
of a sudden, he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons." And he said, "I was all in my feelings." I said, "I know that." I said, "If I was somebody who was all sensitive and stuff, you know where you be."
Yes, we get in our feelings from time to time, don't we?
But that's because we are overly emotional because we haven't been allowed to be human by
Yeah.
our own folks and our circumstances. We're very emotional,
Yeah.
right? We feel everything. And so now, if we ain't got something to numb it, either sex, alcohol, video games, you want me down the list? And you catch us without being numb? And then you done been told I can't smile because somebody thinks there's. You think about it. How many times as a black man you smiling and people look at you, what you smiling about? Because I'm happy, brother.
And that's okay. It's okay to be happy.
But the other sad part about it, and I know this is not part of the conversation, I should be quiet, is our young girls are doing the same thing because they're imitating the boys because they got tired of being taken advantage of.
Mm,
And they're taking it to a whole nother level.
mm.
And brothers can't handle it because them girls are doing boy stuff, that raggedy boy stuff at a different level than the brothers can handle. The brothers, man, the brothers are terrified. Look at Bobby. Bobby, no, because that's off the chain. Because they got
Yeah.
tired of watching the mamas, the aunties, and all of them be taken advantage of. And so we're going to roll it back on you. And the brothers can't handle it. And they losing their minds because the sisters are cold with it. And it
Yeah.
ain't no good for them either. But
No.
we done.
And
I
it's
don't went someplace I didn't need to go,
listen,
and but I love it that he brought that up because that's the kind of conversation we can have these technical conversations about trauma all day.
yes.
But that's the stuff that's real because it is real. And I'm glad that we got three different generations here because, you got Bobby, got Leo, and you got my old behind that's supposed to be the grandfather or whatever. But think about it. We got old Negroes my age acting like Bobby out here. Now, how is he supposed to follow him? Because the young dude said, "Man, Mr. Said, I don't know why you give me a hard time. I'm gonna grow up out of this." I said, "Look, you got to think about a holiday gathering. Do you have your father that you, in some cases, uncle, a cousin, older cousin, who's trying to chase your woman, making passes at your woman at the Thanksgiving table,
Mm.
and they say, 'Oh wow, Uncle Pookie,' you know." And so my point is, you just don't get mature without no by accident. You just
Right.
get this be an old little gangster. The only difference between a young man like Bobby and me is technique. Our mentality might be the same. So I'm
Right.
just gonna use a little bit more, little bit more crumbs to get girlfriend to follow me.
Wow, that makes so much sense. That's the only difference is technique. The mentality it could be the same, and that's the point. I think that we need to really like hammer home. Like these things are culturally specific for us. We've learned them. They've been passed down generation from generation. I want to share another video with y'all because we are at our hour. For some reason, our hour goes by so fast. We are at our
It's my
hour.
fault.
I have another video. Say that. What's that, Mr. Simmons?
It's my fault.
No, no, it's not. There's no fault here. This is just good conversation. And sometimes it's hard to put a time limit on it because there's so much to talk about. That's why this is a series. We're going to get into a lot more next week as well when we start talking about solutions. But let me play this video. It's called Experiencing Racial Trauma. And this is just a young woman who talks about how her mentality was passed down from her father, that was passed down from his father. And I think it was a very, very interesting way to look at things. And it really talks very specifically about how we all individually experience racial trauma. All right.
My father's early experience of, basically watching his parents die because they were not allowed to go to the hospital because there were no hospitals for Black people. The trauma from that, my father being left an orphan with his younger brother, had a huge impact on him and then consequently on me. That was one of the earliest experiences connected to my father. The next would be my experience of being a part of the Operation Exodus program and being bused. There were only 20 of us that went to this particular school. Being in a Black community, and then suddenly you're plucked out of that and you're on this yellow bus and it rocks up to this school where everybody in the school is white. And suddenly I became an other. And so I was often accused of cheating. I was often shamed in front of the class. I experienced just repeated incidents, and my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, experienced even more. My brother, Saladin, was assigned to Hyde Park High. There were everyday protests, and people, white folk, men, women, children, standing along the side of the road, swearing, throwing rocks, and the kids having to go through that every single day was extremely traumatizing for them. My sister-in-law tells the story of being on the bus and sitting next to a girl when a brick came through the window, and the glass hit the girl in the eye, and there was a real fear, as blood streaming down. She's traumatized watching this. That was the kind of thing that the students face every day on their way to school and coming back home. So there were white students who were actually attending the school. They did come to school, and there were constant fights that would erupt, and the police would have to be called in. It was chaos in the schools. And in other communities like South Boston, where early on, like, the white students just refused to go to school. Charlestown was the same thing. Those kind of things really affect, like, one's perceptions of self, of other. Am I able to trust white people? We're talking in the 70s, and now we fast forward, it's 2019. And what are the ways in which things have changed, and what are the ways in which things are still the same? In some cases, it's not a brick and it's not a rock, but it's a word. Anyone who's lived long enough, we've heard that before. We've seen it, we've experienced it. The more things change, the more they stay the same, and that's sad.
When I watched this, I just thought it was very insightful as we think about historical trauma, racial trauma, and how it affects us individually, how it affects us raising our kids, being in our families, and then how we show up in our communities. And Leo, this is one of the questions that I had for you, because you've worked from infants all the way through juveniles, and understanding how all of these things affect their mental health. The question I have for you is, how do we encourage our children to embrace that historical trauma, but still disconnect themselves from it so that they can grow? Because at some point we need to stop thinking about what was and thinking about where we want to be. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge. So how do we approach that with families, with children, to say, yeah, and that was in the 70s, and it still probably happens today to our children in school in some way or another?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, just going off the top of my head, is talking about it. I think we've kind of talked about that a little bit today, is talking about the trauma, talking about what's going on, and not keeping that inside. And then and that's all trauma. That's all trauma. Getting to a space where you asked this question earlier, Tawana, like, what does the conversation around trauma in your household look like? You asked Mr. Arnold that earlier. And that just made me think of, like, what what are we talking about in the household? What are we talking about amongst ourselves? Like, how do we get, like, we can't get to a point of healing or get to a point of moving forward if we don't know what's wrong with us. If we don't, and I think Mr. Simmons touched on this earlier too, if we're not in a space where we can actually have those real conversations within our own community, we're talking about what's going on, what, we're ended up finding out that, our grandfathers had this substance abuse issue and this and this and this happened. And we find out years down the road after they done passed already. And now we done developed some of the things going on. I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind is just getting to a space where we can talk about it, where it's not taboo, where it's not, oh, we're not going to talk about that. Hush, hush, hush. Be strong. Don't. That's a sign of weakness. I think the first thing to take that step in terms of getting to a space of healing, of knowledge, of being able to focus on where we want to go, we have to figure out what actually happened. We have to talk about like how that impacted us and how it impacts us today. One of the things that has come up a few times is love. We have to show love to each other. We have to show love to ourselves. And I think what that looks like is getting to a space where we're able to give each other grace. We're able to give each other grace. And we know that things aren't going to be perfect. And we know that there'll be some back and forth. But ultimately, the only way to get through some of that and be okay with saying, hey, I've gone through this, is to have someone on the other side listening, understanding. And it helps to have someone who looks like you. I say representation matters. If I'm talking to Sam, if I'm talking to Bobby about trauma and things that I've gone through, I'm gonna be a lot more, I'm gonna talk about it a lot quicker with them than somebody who doesn't look like me, especially the conversation that we're having right now. So I think representation matters, first of all. And then I think getting to a space where we as a community are actually diving into this stuff. Like, what's the saying, the quote, you can't heal what you don't reveal. Like, you can't get this stuff up off you if you don't know what it is. And so I'd love to talk about where we're going, and I love that conversation. And I think before we get there, though, we have to be okay with the fact that we may not be okay. Like, understanding that this stuff already happened. Like, we can't change the fact that it already happened, but sweeping it under the rug isn't going to help. We can't get to that space of healing. We can't get to that space of developing things, because I can get to the whole, I've developed a curriculum for young people who are resistant to traditional talk therapy and this, that, and the third, using hip hop to like really drive that home. But we can't even get that process started if we are not all on the same page of, okay, let's actually talk about this. Let's get to a point where we can put this out there, express what we're going through, and go from there. I'm going to be quiet because I know other people want to touch on it. But I would say the short answer, and I can't answer the full question because that's a broad topic. That's a big question.
Yes, it is.
I would say how we start, though, is being real with ourselves, being real within our community, within our household, with each other, and showing more love to each other. This has been said a few times today. We are sometimes our own harshest critics. We are the people who are looking down on ourselves, on each other within the community. And so it takes for us to get over some of that too. And I think like I talk a lot about working in silos, but I think we're living in silos at times too. You get to a space where some people can see, oh, they're successful, they're doing this, they're doing that. And because of historical trauma, because of community things, because of all these things you could throw in there, it's like we're not building together. We're not coming together. So like I said, I know I'm starting to ramble, get on a tangent. I'm gonna let someone else talk. But I really do think it's important for us to get to a space where we're okay with knowing that we may not be okay.
Yeah, and really embracing the fact that our history has impacted our present. I had this conversation with my son yesterday that history matters. It's important to know where we've been so that we understand where we are, and not even so much looking ahead of where we want to go, but even just understanding where we are, we have to look at history. And so all of the historical trauma that Black folks have had from generation to generation, that's really just supposedly gotten better since the 50s, since we've had, our civil rights movement. Things have not been good for us. And the fact that we're passing this down epigenetically, Mr. Simmons, from generation to generation, and then we're expecting our children to then to then deal with the toxic stress that they deal with every day, whether it's, my mom's got to work all the time, I'm raising myself, I don't know what I'm going to eat tonight, how am I even going to get to school tomorrow because I got to take care of my little sister. And even though this isn't the narrative for everyone in the Black community, it is a narrative for a lot of our folks. And so, Mr. Simmons, how do we begin to move from the historical trauma to creating new pathways for us as adults and for our young Black men?
Okay, so since I'm done talking, it really boils down to, it's hard to hear when you can't tell the truth. When I say to tell the truth, I'm talking about the whole truth, not only the pieces we feel comfortable with. If healing was easy, everybody would do it, but it's not. Not when you start, because truth is where it's at, and a lot of times we only want to tell part of the truth, and that part of the truth is focused on the area we have no control over. So we like talking about systems, and we like talking about all that kind of stuff. But I think the power is really within in the community. If we got a better handle on how we feel about ourselves, a better handle on being able to be distant. See, the thing is we always want to talk about coming together. That ain't happening anytime soon. If I waited for everybody to accept the idea around uh, trauma in Black men, there wouldn't have never been a conflict. Okay, if Martin Luther King waited for everybody to believe in nonviolence, there would have never been a Martin Luther King, because there was a whole lot of Black folks who did not agree with Martin Luther King, and one of them was my dad.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't even tell the truth about that. But he believed in us enough to stick to it. So sometimes it comes down to, because we're very codependent people. We always talk about what other people ain't doing and kumbaya and that kind of stuff. Sometimes we got to be comfortable enough to do it alone and believe that what we're doing is important enough and hope that folks will follow us and support us. It's a lonely thing out here trying to do the right thing, and it ain't nothing. And then we just got to get comfortable with that, right? And
Yeah.
so, and in the care of other people. But I know, at least personally, that if I waited for folks to accept the stuff I was saying and accept me, we would not. I would not be here, right? And I've been lucky that maybe the old folks took a while to catch up, but young folks, it made more sense to them because I was talking about what they were experiencing to some degree, and they have come along and supported and that kind of stuff. So I don't always have the traditional answer because I didn't come up into this with the traditional education and all the other kind of stuff. All of this stuff is developed out of observation, out of care, and that kind of stuff. But I guess the big one is when we're really to tell the truth, the internal truth, not that the surface stuff, because we are surface people. We're more into what we look like, what we smell like, and what we drive, right? And then
Yeah.
behind the scenes, be all raggedy. And then we want to give a hard
Mhm.
time to the brother in the hood, but you know who some of the most dangerous folks is? The brother in the suburb who's faking and shaking. Okay,
Wow. Yeah.
because at least the brother in the hood is almost living a real life. It might be raggedy as heck, but it's still real. Okay,
Yeah.
and he's in a position where he can't even tell a lie because it's so out there. Now he might not understand how he contributes to it, right? But you get these fake and shake folks out here who want to look down on everybody else, stir up the brother in the hood, talking about marching and all like that. And the brother don't even live in the hood, and watch y'all on TV while y'all all stirred up, and then y'all wonder why y'all stirred up, So you gotta have a plan to win, you know, and you gotta
True.
understand what winning looks like. Does winning looks like that every white people accept you who you are? No. Winning looks like I accept me and I do the best I can and don't waste a whole lot of my life worrying about them because they're not worried about me.
Ashe.
Wait, can I, or my bad, but can I say
No,
something
Yeah, go
on
ahead.
what
absolutely.
Mr. Howard said a second ago on historical trauma? Especially in the households, I feel like what it takes is a conversation, transparency, and vulnerability throughout our parents. You feel me? Because once I had conversations, like my mom is a very open person. She has very deep, meaningful conversations, and once as a kid, as an 18-year-old young man, understands the traumas that my older parents face, like the older things that they face, it gives me some type of understanding to why they are the way they are, you know, some of the teachings, some of the lessons that they give us. And one thing, I saw a video on social media that I'm going to try to remember. It's like a dude saying that his dad only had a father until the age of 7. His dad's example of a father was only up until the age of 7. So his dad doesn't have the coping skills and the skills to be able to be a father through early adulthood, teenage years, because his father was only present until he was 7. I feel like understanding things like that, especially from our older Black men, you feel
Yeah.
me? Because my father, he didn't have a father growing up. You feel me? He didn't have no support system. Once I understood the emotional evaluation of his childhood, of how he grew up, it gave me some type of understanding to why he is the way he is. You feel me? And it took something out of me. It kind of gave me some type of relief that, you know what, he's not this way because he doesn't love me, but he's this way because trauma and all the things that he faced made him into who he is. You feel me? So I can't hold it against people for the way they are because of trauma. You know, my parents, they are the way they are because of things they face. And once I understood that, once I seen that, and once I understood that on a deeper level, it gave me some type of relief that they love me. They want the best interest for me no matter what happens. But they teach the way they teach. They do the things the way they do because of things that they were given and the things that they were faced. You feel me? Like,
Yeah.
so I just felt like that is a very important conversation to have, especially like if you guys have kids or children, have conversations with the things that you went through and let them understand, not trying to put it on them because you want to be like, oh, I went through this much more than you, but some type of understanding. Because once your child has that understanding of, okay, you are the way you are because of the trauma, it opens up a whole new door into relationships. So I just wanted to say that.
Bobby, that is amazing because I think as parents, Mr. Simmons, it's always do as I say and not as I do. I don't know that we even openly share our vulnerabilities with our children because we don't want to feel like we're weak in our own household.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me do this quickly. One of the exercises I do with my guys sometimes is do what we call a trauma tree. You know, people talk about a family tree. If you do a trauma tree, you'll learn a lot about why. You know, I was lucky enough to go back to my grandparents. It's like, okay, oh, they did the best they could considering their trauma, right? So, you know, Bobby's on point. You know, and see, we get scared of that truth. Not realizing that's where it starts. Not realizing truth will set you free. When they say that, it's true. It does not mean it ain't gonna be painful initially, but it will over time set you free. So I know. Aren't we ready to stop talking?
Yes, Mr. Simmons. You're listening to Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health podcast. We're leading with knowledge, compassion, and support. Please take a moment to follow our channel, subscribe, and turn on notifications for future episodes. And as Mr. Simmons has let us know, it is time for us to get out of here. We have gone past our hour again. It's so funny because my parting question that I wanted to ask you all is, where does the healing begin? But I feel like we've already kind of talked about that, Bobby. Healing begins at home. It begins with the adults in your lives, in the lives of children, to start being open and honest about our experiences so that they can understand that we know what we're talking about sometimes. But I think that's also going to allow us as the adults in the room to think about how we've processed our own trauma and how that's passing down to our children. Bobby, how does the healing begin? Where does it begin? If you want to add anything else to that.
It begins first of all in ourselves. You feel me? We have to have an understanding that we are the way we are because of things that we face, whether it's you're old, you're in your middle age, or you're young. You have to understand that you went through these things and it made you who you are today. And you can't hold that against yourself, or you can't hold it against your parenting style, how you build relationships. But you got to understand that, okay, I am like this. You got to move better. You got to have an understand. You got to want better for yourself. If you don't want better for yourself, you're not going to get better. Can't nobody make you better. Can't nobody force you better. You got to want it in yourself. And then if you're a parent, you got to go to your household because you never know that sometimes you're putting some of your trauma onto your kids, onto your brothers, your sisters, your aunties, friendships. But you got to understand yourself and the things that you go through before you want to heal families or anybody else. So yeah, I'll say healing starts within and then it goes to the home. And then it just continues to go out. 1 second, sorry.
Leo, please add to that. I think Bobby did a really good job
Yeah.
letting us know where the healing begins. But what do you have to offer in addition to what Bobby said?
Absolutely. I'll just piggyback off that. It's about having that understanding within yourself, but then also being real. We've talked about it a few times today. Being able to have those hard conversations, being able to be real about what we've experienced and understanding that it's not easy. I think that's the other thing. I mentioned it before. When you are real with yourself, when you are real with other people, and you have these deep conversations, I think it's also important to give grace and receive grace and give yourself grace. I think we, especially as Black men, walk around with the weight of the world on our shoulders, and it's so easy to just those internal thoughts, the self-talk that you do, just to tell yourself, I'm not doing enough. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. And just we put the most pressure on ourselves. And so I think it starts with the understanding, the openness, having those conversations, but then also understanding that this stuff is hard. It's hard to have these conversations. It'll be hard for, like Bobby said, if you're old, middle-aged, or young. So when we're talking to our parents, talking to our grandparents, going through that trauma tree, understanding that this stuff is hard. This stuff is hard to talk about. It's hard to discuss, and understanding that part of that healing is getting through that hard.
Absolutely. Mr. Simmons, as usual, I'd like to end with your comments. What do you have to add to that conversation? Where does the healing begin?
It begins with you, but I was done 4 minutes ago.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Simmons, for being done and for being here from Detroit. Thank you for taking the time out of your celebration there in Detroit, Michigan. I really appreciate you coming through today. Leo, thank you so much. I just enjoy anytime we have conversations. And Bobby, we're going to talk more about your book next week, because I think that it's really important to share kind of what that meant to you to publish your own book of poetry, and kind of what your idea was for your peers when you were doing that. So we're going to talk more about that next week. But thank you, Bobby, for being here. Go ahead, Leo.
Juan, I just wanted to say thank you to you, because this space, being in this environment, having 3 Black men being able to talk amongst ourselves, we may not agree on everything, and I think that's the important part, is being able to have discourse and discussion and conversation without it getting to, oh, no, you don't know what you're talking. I just appreciate the space. I really enjoy talking with Mr. Arnold, Mr. Simmons, and being in a space where we can just build community. So I want to thank you, Tawana, for creating this platform for us, and just putting us all in the same room. It's a blessing.
Very welcome. You're very welcome. Go ahead, Bobby. You had something else you wanted to add?
Oh, I was just agreeing. Like, it feels good to have a space like this, being able to talk and understanding, like, from generations that's older than me, like, the things that we go through is very insightful, and I do appreciate it.
Well, thank you. We all appreciate each other. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation next week when we talk about solutions. We're going to take all of this conversation about historical trauma, how we begin to heal. And we're really going to talk about how we begin to heal, and how you all, in the spaces that you occupy, actually have resources that are out here that people can tap into right now, today, that will help them build up their own capacity to encourage and be a positive impact on the young Black boys that are in their lives. So again, thank you. We will see you next week. Hold on. I feel like I always have to leave this way now. So hold on 1 second. All right, y'all. I will give you the rest of your day. Thank you very much for joining. I'm going to let you guys go ahead while I just give some more house cleaning stuff to the people who have joined us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
All right. Man, boy, do I have such a good time doing this. This is really what I love doing, and I enjoy the opportunity to bring our community partners to you and talk about the challenges that we face as we raise our young children. So thank you again to Leo, Mr. Howard. I'm sorry, Leo and Mr. Howard are the same people. But thank you to Leo, Bobby, and Mr. Simmons for joining me. Next week, we have our full panel back. So Keem Anderson's going to join us. Lambers Fishers will be back, along with the three wonderful men that you saw here today. So one of the things that I want to just wrap this up with is by saying that understanding what that trauma tree is, I have never heard of that, of really sitting down and thinking about the things that you as an individual and that your family has faced, because all of that trauma that's already piled on top of the historical trauma that we carry within our genes anyway can sometimes be overwhelming. And so understanding is always the first step to healing, I believe. So we're going to be back next week. Again, we're talking about solutions. Mr. Howard is with United Way. Mr. Simmons has an awesome consulting firm and a great conference that he puts on every year. Keem is going to be back. He's been working in the after school spaces for as long as he's really been a young man. And then Lambers is going to come back with a different perspective as well, as a licensed marriage and family therapist. And we're going to talk solutions, because we have had the conversations long enough, and it's time to move from having these conversations to effective action. And that's what we're hoping they'll be able to do with you next week. Again, we want you to share. Let us know what you like, what you don't like. Subscribe so that you know when we are live next week. Again, thank you very much for tuning in. My name's Twana. I'll see you later. All right.